Hello, my name's Noel Kingsbury, and with my colleague Annie Guilfoyle, I run Garden Masterclass. Now, Annie and I started Garden Masterclass 6 years ago to put on live educational events in the British Isles. But with COVID, the lockdown, in April 2020, we started doing a public service broadcast. And then we've settled down to running both live events, but also with a big online content. So we do this Thursday Garden Chat once a week on a Thursday evening, 6 o'clock Western European time. And those recordings then go up on to YouTube. Now, we also do webinars. We have a webinar season that runs through from September to May. We get leading experts globally from the garden and landscape world to talk about their specialism. And of course, that's an opportunity to ask them questions. Most of those webinars are recorded and are then available through Vimeo from our website. We also put on courses. There's a course on naturalistic planting design, for example, which I do with Professor Nigel Dunnett of the University of Sheffield in Northern England. And we sometimes get involved in organising conferences. We do all sorts of things that are aimed at encouraging quality planting, quality gardening, knowledge about plants and botany, plant science, and we hope you'll join us. We have a membership scheme which gives you discounts on our webinars and live events and various other goodies, but also you can just sign up for our monthly email newsletter to keep in touch with what we're doing. We believe, and we've been told by many people, that what we do is unique. It's unique in the range and quality of people we talk to and our global reach and our diversity. So hope you enjoy this particular episode and do come back for more.
Anyway, tonight we have, I was going to say an old friend, but that sounds a bit like an old, you are an old friend, Gwendolyn, but you are a good friend of ours on Garden Masterclass. You've been on a few times in various situations. Gwendolyn van Paasschen is, of course, the director of Denmans Gardens. Very, very special, iconic, wonderful gardens, luckily on my doorstep, which is fantastic. So Gwendolyn, welcome again. Lovely to see you.
It's a pleasure. I'm just going to say two things before I start.
Okay. You're only allowed one thing.
You won't be sorry.
Okay, all right, go on then.
I strongly encourage everyone to become a member of this amazing Garden Masterclass. It's brilliant, and tell your friends. It's such an amazing resource. And it's international, which I think is just as dimensions that are really, really special and important. And second of all, what was the second thing? Can't remember. I suppose, well,
it'll come back.
I'm going to say it later when I remember. But most of all, I want to say thank you very much for, I know, I saw Wild Side Garden in Chatsworth, and it is a fantastic film that you will be in tears by halfway through it, and it's such a wonderful story. So if you have a chance, download it and watch it. It's fabulous.
Yeah, well, in fact, just to let everybody know that we do have plans for everybody to watch it over the Christmas period, and we'll announce that in our December newsletter. We've got lots of lovely things to announce in our December newsletter, so if you're not on the mailing list, that's a jolly good reason to be on the mailing list at least. And as Gwendolyn wonderfully said, and I will give you £20 for that, Gwendolyn, yes, members obviously get more perks too, but if you are somewhere in the extremities of the world and you haven't got a chance or you haven't seen it, then we will be showing it. Anyway, we've got Gwendolyn talking about her desert island gardens. We haven't done a desert island gardens for months and months and months actually, and that's very remiss because it's such a nice thing to do, and we find out so much about our guests through their gardens of choice, and I deliberately haven't asked Gwendolyn what her gardens are, and yesterday we had a little run through, and again I deliberately didn't let her go into what her gardens were. So as some of you may or may not know, this is based on Desert Island Discs, which is a BBC, long-standing BBC programme, where the guests are asked to choose 8 pieces of music, and they're allowed to choose 1 item to take with them to a desert island and 1 book. And so we've condensed that down to 5 gardens that have influenced them through their life, 1 item that could be anything related to gardening or not, and 1 book. So those are the rules, Gwendolyn, and I hope you're sticking to them, because actually quite a few people have broken the rules in the past. So maybe, I don't know, let's see whether you're a rule breaker or not.
There's time to break rules, and
There's time. Anyway, so do you want to get going on your desert island gardens? Great, let's go.
I also just want to thank you for letting me take center stage again. It was really fun to put together my desert island gardens and my favorite book and my favorite tool. I think I learned a little bit about myself and sort of my feelings about what gardens are all about. It also, I think my choices sort of reveal my journey from Georgetown in Washington, D.C. to Denmans, which is where I live. So I'll start. I think, like all of you masterclass fans, I am a passionate gardener, and I think I probably was at birth. Oh, this is the part where I share my screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's that part. There we go. That didn't work.
Yeah, no, it's going through. It's going through.
Okay, good.
Yeah, you've just got to get onto full screen now, onto slideshow.
I knew that. We went through this yesterday, didn't we?
Yeah.
Okay, there we are.
It's great.
So here we are. As a child, I remember planting marigolds and morning glories with my mother under our garden apartment window. And we lived in Seattle, so it was just the ideal gardening area. I was absolutely delighted when the morning glories took over the chain linked fence right outside the window, and absolutely horrified when the slugs ate all of our marigolds. To this day, I can't look at marigolds without looking for slug damage. And other gardening experiences, sort of experiments over the course of my childhood and early adulthood, had similar successes and disappointments, but that's how you learn. So back in the day, Seattle and the Pacific Northwest was the idyllic place to grow up. Everybody's gardens were chock-a with all kinds of amazing plants, especially ones that bloomed year-round. Winter blooming camellias and cherry trees grew magnificently against the backdrop of soaring evergreens. Azaleas dominated spring. Summer could be riotous. Autumn was the best time to peel long bits of terracotta-colored bark off the mahonia trees. Before Microsoft and Amazon destroyed it, it was an endless chain of wide open spaces with acres of woods, farmlands, meadows, and forest. The woods were ideal for making forts and damming up puddles, which Antony and I have discussed many times. Evergreen fern fronds were perfect for sword fights, and there were lots of shaky trees that were perfect for tree houses. We were surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands of miles of trails, hiking trails, meadows in which to pick wildflowers and blackberries. Nature was in abundance, and it dominated our lives. Mountains, sea, lake, rivers, what else could a growing child want? Except for maybe a little less rain. It wasn't until I moved to Washington, D.C., however, that I discovered a proper designed garden, and that was Dumbarton Oaks. Dumbarton is in Georgetown in Washington and was designed for a diplomat's family in the early 20th century. Comprised of a series of terraces with an Italianate flair, it has a small amphitheater and a large woodland right in the heart of the city. People flock there for picnics and all kinds of things, strolling, walking. I guess they can't walk the dog, but reading books, chatting, a wonderful place. So my first career was not in horticulture. It was in politics. I worked in the Senate, first for a Washington state senator, Slade Gorton, and then latterly for John McCain from Arizona. My hobby was obsessive, if amateurish, gardening. A Southern friend whose husband served in Congress convinced me to apply for a plot in a nearby Victory Garden. Who knew what they were all about? That was new to me. Suddenly we were growing okra, pumpkins, and chard, and picking tomatoes before they were ripe, so she could make fried green tomatoes. She'd also collect marigold seeds and broadcast them in any bare space, and I was thrilled when they came up and began to bloom slug-free. My tiny townhouse garden was a mixture of success and failure. I remember being absolutely devastated when I discovered that Gladiolus Morellii only bloomed once a year. And my Senate colleagues were forever being dragged out of the office at lunchtime to accompany me as I crisscrossed Capitol Hill to admire small town gardens that surrounded the Senate buildings and to walk the Capitol grounds admiring specimen trees. I remembered the first time I put my face in the beautiful fragrant blossoms of Magnolia grandiflora and breathing in its perfume, the magic that was, and the resilience of long neglected roses growing beside abandoned buildings. In wintertime, the small botanic garden was only a 15-minute walk from my office. And then in 1988, upon the advice of a mutual English friend, we went to visit Gravetime Manor for the first time. It was winter, just after the great hurricane of 1987, and the evidence of devastation was everywhere, of course, but the leucojum bloomed magnificently near the front door. Fritillaria filled the sloping meadow, and the epic veg garden was bursting with early crops. I was pretty much flabbergasted. A door had opened into the world of design gardens, and I was never to come out of it. In 1990, I visited a friend at his country estate north of New York City. Over 400 acres. It had a walled garden, a pool, a conservatory. It was drop dead gorgeous. And on the drive home, it occurred to me that someone was designing this magnificent garden, and it wasn't me. Standing the next day in a warm August thunderstorm at Dumbarton Oaks, I stood watching rain rivulets course down the silver bark of a beautiful beech tree, and I decided that it was time to make a change. In short order, to the utter astonishment and disbelief of my colleagues, I left the Senate and began studying garden design at a local college. I will only add a footnote here because my daughter's watching that I was also pregnant. A year or so later, someone told me about this English guy, designer named John Brookes, and urged me to find a way to study with him. She'd just returned from a course that he was giving in some garden in England called Denmans. Amazingly, he was offering a 3-day masterclass at the New York Botanical Garden, and I signed up. Being well into my design program, I was gobsmacked. I learned more from him in those 3 days than I did from my entire class. John was an incredibly compelling teacher, and the class was so interesting and fabulous that I took it again a couple of years later. By that time, I was living in Connecticut, and I was completing my garden design certificate at the New York Botanical Garden. Only an hour and a half away lived that friend with that 400-acre estate that had led me to change careers in the first place. Miraculously, he asked me to work for him as a sort of consultant. He was unhappy with his current designer. I later discovered he'd engaged Russell Page to design his garden, but Page had become too ill to continue. Well, let's face it, the ink on my garden design certificate was hardly dry, and I was in no way qualified to take on this massive project on my own. So it was time to find a proper landscape designer. I mentioned this John Brookes guy to him, but he wanted an American, so the search was on. We interviewed several and engaged 2 who didn't really work out, and I finally persuaded my friend to summon the Englishman. So John arrived in the dead of night in a blinding snowstorm in March of 1998, just the day before my birthday. And you'll be happy to know that this finally brings me to my first garden, my first favorite garden. Located 2.5 hours north of New York City, and overlooking the Catskill Mountains. The original Victorian house had been built for robber barons in the late 1900s, and it had burned down in a massive fire. The brick Georgian mansion that had placed it is at the top of the hill and overlooks the Catskills, as well as forest and parkland. The client had first purchased it in the early 1980s, and after renovating the house, he finally turned his attention to the garden. By the time I was brought on board, Altamont had, among other things, terraces, a pool with a pool house, a 4-roomed walled garden that was badly sited, a conservatory greenhouse that was badly sited, any number of outbuildings and staff houses, and acres and acres and acres of lawn. Much that had been created was, as I said, badly sited or out of proportion. The wrong materials had been used, the sight lines were blocked, there was almost no seating, and some of the planting choices could only be best described as bizarre. Who plants a monoculture of deciduous azaleas in the hot sun in a walled garden anyway? And that one short snowy weekend, John laid out a plan for the entire garden that we spent the next 5 years building. We knocked the front and back walls out of the top of the walled garden rooms and created a seating area beyond which we called the hanging gardens. It was a series of terraces that went down the hill to the pool. We revised all the other walled gardens rooms as well. We created a winter garden. We revised access to all the buildings at the top of the hill. I remember John looking at the steps that went from the terraces down to the lawn and muttered under his breath, "These are just mean, much too narrow, much too short." So we revised all the terraces and opened views, and that's just among other things. We then went on to move the orchard. We created walks through acres of woodland. We built a 2-acre kitchen garden with 6,000 square feet of Alatex glass houses, and we revised the paddocks. And we brought Anthony Archer Wills in, the great water garden designer, and with his expertise and genius, we created waterfalls, lakes, boardwalks, wetlands, and streams. Again, among other things. The result is an amazing, peaceful estate with endless walks, intimate spaces, gracious views, all knitted together with John's sense of flow, proportion, and structure. It's wonderful. Well, my second garden is quite different. It's also in the States, and it's on Mount Desert Island in Maine. It's called Garland Farms and could easily have been lost. It is tiny compared to Altamont, but its history is wonderful because it is the last garden of the brilliant landscape architect Beatrix Farrand. She was formidable and highly accomplished, and at age 27, the lone female founder of the American Society of Landscape Architects. During her illustrious career, Farrand designed over 200 gardens, magnificent public and private gardens, including the White House Rose Garden and my beloved Dumbarton Oaks. Her original home in Maine was Reef Point, which she and her late husband had hoped to turn into a botanical garden of sorts and sort of a horticultural center, but it didn't attract enough visitors or interest. And to make a long story short, she was unable to afford its upkeep at the end of her life, so she moved to Garland Farm. It happened to belong to her friend Amy Magdalene Garland and her husband Lewis, who also lived there. In time, Farrand became so attached to Garland Farm that she included a codicil in her will mandating that if she was the last of her immediate friends to die, the garden should be dismantled. Instead, she was the first of her friends to die, and the others couldn't bring themselves to take it apart. Fortunately, the garden only changed hands twice after her death, and it was eventually completely forgotten until an elderly woman approached garden designer Patrick Chassé after a lecture in Bar Harbor one evening and told him she owned Beatrix Farrand's last garden, and she invited him to visit. Initially skeptical, he was astounded to discover her story was true. He subsequently started the Beatrix Farrand Society and raised the money in order to purchase it, to restore it, and to create a center of horticultural education. Fortunately, enough of Farron's design survived to permit restoration. Now, once the property was purchased, an amazing woman named Gail Hollenbeck, a student in a local master garden class program, volunteered to work in the garden. She was amazing. Fast forward, and Farron's terrace garden with Chassay's guidance and Hollenbeck's remarkable gifts, ranging from horticultural knowledge and expertise to a natural gift for forensic archaeology, has been painstakingly restored. Gail told me that restoring the terrace garden was like doing a jigsaw puzzle, but I think that's a complete understatement. At best, it seems like doing a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle couched in a scavenger hunt with several pieces and the instructions missing. The terrace garden is bordered on 3 sides by a simple beige fence with a house on the 4th side. As tiny as it is divided into 3 distinct sections. The first relates to Farron's wing of the house. The second and the center relates to the study. And the third relates to the wing of her carer, Clementine. The center walk begins at the study's double French doors with a doorstep comprised of a roughly hewn granite millstone covered with creeping thyme. The short walk to the opposite side of the garden is comprised of indigenous granite stones and terminates at an antique Asian Bodavista figure that she had brought with her from Reef Point. The beds on either side are planted with heather. Like the rest of the flower gardens on the terrace, the exact edges of the beds and the walk had to be excavated by Hollenbeck and her team, since the borders had long since melted away. The original slate edging tiles were accidentally found in the nearby barn, so they could put those back where they belonged. Now, Beatrix's side is planted in grays, pinks, and quiet blues, and includes plants that she brought with her from Reef Point, while orange and yellow flowers dominate clementines. What I loved about this little terrace garden is the integrity of its composition, which was no mean feat, as it's a complex combination of materials, plants, and color. Here, Farron balances symmetry and asymmetry, and she broke a few rules. Not many designers would combine the yellows and oranges on the one side of this tiny garden with the soft lavenders, pinks, and grays on the other side without a more pronounced visual barrier. It's somewhat shocking to see the combination, but somehow that really did work. Less obviously, she blended plants she had an emotional attachment to in a way that a designer might not have done for a client. Like this Saxifraga ex Macnabiana, which I practiced saying 1,000 times, which looks completely out of place. Here, Beatrix indulged herself. After all, she was her own client. The garden's details are surprisingly eclectic. It includes an Asian statue, an American millstone, squirrel and bird faucet handles, trellises, and bird baths. Yet the entire design hangs together really well and reads well as a whole. As I said, recovering some of these pieces was part of a scavenger hunt. The lead planter that had once been at Garland Farms had somehow found its way to nearby Thuya Gardens, but it was returned in 2012. Beatrix never meant for this little garden to be visited, but she designed it exclusively for herself and Clementine. So at the end of the day, I'm not sure that I don't love the story of how the garden was created and then saved by an inspected community of people as much as I love the garden itself. Now, saving the garden is the theme of my second garden, which is in France, or this is the third garden. Serre-la-Madone is in Menton in southern France and was also one of John Brookes's favorite gardens. It was he who suggested I visit. He first visited it in the 1950s as a callow 17-year-old, describing it as slightly run down, but dreamy and so romantic. And it was, when I saw it, just as John described it. It's a 14-acre garden created between 1924 and 1939 by Major Lawrence Johnston, a shy plant collector who designed only one other garden in his life, and that's Hidcote Manor in the Cotswolds, which he created for his Baltimore-born mother. In 1914, he joined the British Army to fight in the Boer War. He was badly wounded and left for dead. But amazingly, a Cotswold neighbor saw him, recognized him, saw him twitching, and saved his life. He returned to Hidcote with a badly damaged lung. A few years later, his mother began suffering from dementia, and at the recommendation of their doctor, they began spending winters in Monton. Johnston was an avid plant collector. In addition to sponsoring plant finding expeditions, he also went on them to places as far afield as the Alps, Asia, and the Andes. Serres was meant to be Lawrence's earthly paradise and was very different to Hidcote. It was originally probably a grape and olive farm, like all the other terraces around, and it's comprised of sort of ancient terraces. He designed the spaces on each one, and they included plants that he'd collected. The villa itself is at the top, formerly a farmhouse to which he added symmetric wings as well as terraces. It overlooks a large terrace down below with a beautiful pool, a conservatory, and a sculpture, and has a stunning view of the Scorpio Valley. Intricate and complex, at one time the gardens were maintained by a battalion of 12 gardeners. There were none in evidence, however, when we arrived. Johnston left the property to a friend who could not afford its upkeep, and the property was broken up and its plants, birds, and ornaments were distributed among the Monton gardening community, apparently for safekeeping. Unlike Garland Farms, Serres has had a procession of owners since his death in 1958, but fortunately was listed as a historic monument in 1990, and in 1999 passed into the ownership of the Conservatoire du Littoral, which conducted extensive restoration work between 2000 and 2005. Despite this effort, I have to say the garden remains pretty much run down, and it's still dreamy and romantic. Entering the garden from below, you walk up a series of terraces linked by steps, arches, and pergolas. Some of the spaces are shaded deeply, others bathed in the brilliant French sunlight. There are surprises all along the way, a statue here, a pool there, and any number of beautiful plants, until finally you arrive at the main terrace. There you find a gorgeous conservatory full of amazing ferns, facing a long rectangular pool of water, bit green because of the algae, and lined by classic green Provençal herbs. More statuary, a side terrace overlooking the valley, and hidden areas complete this space. From here, there's an arched entrance to the staircase that leads up to the villa. Throughout the garden, there are plantings of unruly flowers, specimen trees, and overgrown shrubs. One wonders what it would have been like at its zenith, with the battalion of gardeners carrying out Major Johnston's orders, the excitement of the arrival of new plants from far away, the long conversations in the conservatory, perhaps planning the next expedition. I can say it was very difficult to leave this atmospheric garden. But leave we must, because it's time to visit my fourth garden, which is in the Netherlands. I was on my way to visit Hummelo again, Piet Oudolf's garden, and had enough time to see another garden along the way. While searching online for one in the same area, I came across one, the description of which intrigued me. It was described as an exotic paradise in the floodplains with an exotic oriental atmosphere, hard to imagine in the Dutch landscape. But I couldn't resist going. It's called the Millinger Theetuin, or tea garden. The garden is accessed through a nature reserve on foot or by bike, which creates a sense of seclusion and suspense. And the entrance was pretty nondescript when I arrived, very relaxed. There was no one there to greet me, nor a gift shop to tempt me, or a plant center to intrigue me, just a polite request to pay inside the restaurant. The creators of the space are Koen van den Boogaard and his partner, the late artist Floor Oskam. Floor moved to the area in 1976 when it was still an abandoned brick factory, taking up and took up residence in the deserted house overlooking the Rhine River. He began working on the garden as a hobby, but after Flora joined him a few years later, the garden became increasingly exotic. The couple were passionate gardeners and traveled widely, coming home from each trip with ideas and inspiration. Eventually, the garden began to attract visitors. So in 1994, they opened the garden to the public. And as more and more tourists came to see the nature reserve, it seemed like a wise decision to add a small coffee shop. Since Flora passed away a few years ago, Cohn spends most of his time now in Spain, and the garden and the restaurant are run by a friend named Rob Frohane, who has expanded the restaurant and continues to manage it in its original spirit. So climbing up the modest steps, I found myself in this other world, peaceful and secluded. Beyond the entrance is this Moorish-style tea house and terrace with well-spaced tables shaded by charming umbrellas. From there, visitors can wander through a set of intimate garden rooms, each unique, overgrown, full of color and enchantment. The garden is near the German border, where the land is relatively hilly relative to the flat Dutch countryside, and the gentle level changes are used to advantage, helping to create separate spaces and to create views from one space to the next. Color is used boldly everywhere and effectively, from the pool and the matching turquoise tiles to cushions and flower pots. There were inviting places to lounge and sit throughout. They gave the garden an opulence that implied long summer evenings with friends, music, and delicious things to eat and drink. And color was evidence everywhere, of course, in the form of plant material, from roses to persicaria, agapanthus, and so much more. The whole place had a slightly decadent atmosphere, rampant, unruly, with a well-proportioned structure that held it together. Though not walled in per se, the garden had a sense of enclosure that enhanced the exotic ambiance, unhurried and peaceful. It was the sort of garden that made you feel as though you wanted to stay for a long while, watching the sun grow low in the sky, the evening melt away into night, and the moon illuminating the garden with silver nightlight. I was actually very thankful for the slow journey back through the nature reserve as I made my way back to Homelo, where I needed a gentle transition back to reality. So speaking of reality, here we are in my current reality. This is Denmans. And as you'll know from our introduction, I own, live, and work here. John Brookes and I had become very good friends in the years that we worked in New York. And in October of 2015, I came for a visit as I had heard he was struggling with a nasty business dispute and he needed help writing his memoir. So I got involved in both, of course. As the business dispute was settled, I came to own the garden, and John began to renovate and rejuvenate with a fierce ferocity that was astonishing for an 84-year-old man. The whole place had become completely dilapidated and neglected because of this business dispute, and he was anxious to put everything back to rights. Unfortunately, he died just a few months later in March of 2018, and we were left without a roadmap as to what he intended, so we had to regroup. And regrouping meant that we had to come to terms and to grips with the history of the property overall. So this leads us to the amazing and formidable Joyce Hilda Robinson, who moved here with her family in 1947. She and her husband, a prominent local grower and farmer, were looking for a place to live and to retire. And the Westergate estate, as it was known then, had everything they were looking for, from conservatories to outbuildings and a nice little cottage. The property had been neglected, seems a theme in this talk, since the war's outbreak, however, and it took them some years to put things back to rights. But soon they had the cottage habitable, called it Denmans, and began farming and growing cut flowers, soft fruit and veg for the Covent Garden market. A dairy followed with pigs and chickens, and in 1952, Mrs. Robinson began working on her ornamental garden in earnest. She was encyclopedic in her plant knowledge, having learned about perennials, alpines, and other plants from local nurserymen and books and experimentation in her previous gardens. She also had an artist eye for creating vignettes and had studied how plants arrange themselves in nature. She became recognized somewhat for her knowledge and her garden. In 1960, Toynbee's nursery sent a young man to take root cuttings of her Romnea culturii, for which she exchanged for winter blooming cyclamen. And she wrote that she had traded plants with Sir Cedric Morris, was known to Mr. Hillier himself, and the garden became well enough known that she was invited to join the National Garden Scheme in 1967. This was also the year that Anthony Archer Wills opened his garden to the National Garden Scheme. She wrote articles for the local papers and published her book, Glorious Disarray, a series of essays about gardening and Denmans in 1990. And she was included in the prestigious New English Woman's Garden, which is by Rosemary Veary and Alvilda Lees Milne. Now, in 1969, she went on a cruise to Greece, and at a morning stop in Delos changed everything. She was absolutely captivated by the way plants grew through the island's gravel and the abundance of different flowers. She'd been looking for a new planting medium, and this was it. The following year, she retired from farming and set about creating her first gravel garden in the walled garden. The walled garden is on the east side of the property, and in a few short years, her gravel experiment had extended to the west side. She loved the look and the practicality of gravel, and as she said, she could walk in the garden dry-shod on a wet day. In 1973, John Brookes came to visit with students from the Inchbald School of Garden Design, of which he was the director. A well-known garden designer by this time, as well as author and lecturer, he had used gravel experimentally in his designs for small, posh London town gardens. So he was absolutely fascinated by the scale at which Mrs. Robinson was working, as well as her naturalistic planting style. He approached her about moving to Denmans and maybe setting up his practice here, but she wouldn't have it. So off he went to Tehran for 2 years to set up the Inchbald School of Interior Design. 1977 was the same year she sold her dairy herd and started creating her representation of 2 dry Sussex riverbeds. In 1979, John came back to England and he returned to Denmans. He had no job, had to restart his landscape practice, and wanted to set up his own design school. Denmans seemed the perfect place. Now confined to a golf club buggy because of rheumatism, Mrs. J.H. relented, and they agreed that he would move into the clock house, the stable block, which he renovated, and start his design school where he managed while managing the garden. Over the years, I think it's important to stress that John didn't change the garden so much as he stylized it. He revised lines, he added sculpture, and integrated a stronger architectural planting structure. Most of the information I just shared with you, though, is not stuff that was available to us when John died. Much has come from Mrs. J.H.'s family in the last 6 years. People who have shared with us their memories and their photographs. We've had to go digging through John's papers, and we've been looking for any kind of articles written from the 70s on, just to learn about the evolution of this extraordinary garden. Overall, I think of the garden as the place where extraordinary horticulture meets extraordinary design. So let me take you on a quick tour. The walled garden, whole garden is about 4 acres, and visitors start their journey in the walled garden, which John revised in 2010 when his friend Angela Bocci died and left him some money in her will. It's a combination of organic and geometric shapes, relaxed plantings and classical elements, formally clipped shrubs, and self-seeded perennials. Among them are also many of Mrs. J.H.'s original plantings, including a kiwi, myrtle, a pomegranate, and her roses. The next is the meadow. John had kept it slightly longer than the lawn from the early 2000s as sort of differential mowing, but at one time it had been a meadow, and we have let it revert, adding bulbs and perennials to attract more pollinators. To the west are the dry riverbeds, which we're just beginning to restore now, a task like all the others have involved digging out photos and a few sketches, and in this case, we've even been digging out the old river rocks. Below lies the pond that John created in 1984 with Anthony Archer Wills, and which we've restored in 2018. It's brimming with life and is presided over by The Dreamer, a sculpture of a boy by Arian Smith. Across the tiny orchard is our new woodland, and above that, the top of the nut walk, which we're also restoring. Mrs. Robinson's cottage is at the top of the slope, and it's nearly surrounded by lawn, gravel gardens, and gravel walks. The gravel garden immediately in front of it was completely overgrown, as you can see from the photo on the left. John cleared it all out in 2018, and he revised its lines, but he left no plan. So after he died, and as we learn more about the garden, we decided that we should restore the garden to its original form in about 1983. The result has been pretty amazing. We still have some planting to do, so we're studying historic documents to select plants that will be sustainable and consistent with Mrs. Robinson's planting style, a task which has actually proven easier than we thought it would be because she was so far ahead of her time. Many of the plants that she included in her original gardens in the 70s and 80s are the drought-tolerant plants that are popular and widely available now. There's another going on. There's a small conservatory, a replacement for a Victorian one that was on its way out, and a restyled pit house that Mrs. Robinson used for propagating when she opened her business, Denmans Plants, in 1984. Beyond that is the approach to Clock House. Clock House was built on an old car park associated with the stables. John laid it out in 1980, complete with a linear gravel garden, his iconic pergola, and his different tropical plants than Mrs. Robinson had used in the rest of the garden, subtropical, I should say. Over the years, he sort of popped his two-dimensional square shapes up into 3D in the form of clipped boxwood cubes, added sculpture, and played with the levels near the old farm road. When I was pruning near Clock House, I was pruning overgrown choisias, Mahonia, and Pittosporum during lockdown. I realized that John's garden here is heavily influenced by Piet Mondrian, the Dutch painter, the Dutch abstract painter. And this is consistent because abstract painting had a great influence on John's work, and he was a great fan of Mondrian's. The rest of the garden shows an influence of the landscape architect, the American landscape architect Thomas Church, and the Brazilian landscape architect Roberto Burle Marx. Now, it would take me the rest of the night to list all the things I love about this garden, so I won't. I will just list a few. First, as I said before, the garden is an extraordinary plantswoman meets extraordinary designer. She developed her planting style, her use of gravel and differential mowing to create a series of compositions through the garden. And John's structure and strong flowing lines, his architectural plants and his sculpture bind the garden together. It all seems so simple until you start looking at it closely, and then you realize how complex it really is. Second, I love the garden's complexity and how it affects almost everyone who visits. It's a great joy to watch visitors sit in the sun on one of John's iconic benches with their eyes closed, sort of thinking about whatever they're thinking, or sequestered in the conservatory with a friend, having a right old chat, or heading back into the garden after having had a cuppa in the cafe, just to take another look. And most of all, I love the garden in autumn and winter when it becomes quiet and fragrant, and the camellias and cyclamen and daphnes and lonicera bloom, when the buds of the stachyurus open and then the bees descend, when the winter aconites carpet the ground beneath the metasequoia. Maybe most of all, I love the community of volunteers, staff, friends, family, and repeat visitors that grows ever longer, ever stronger, and ever bigger. Denmans is now a grade 2 garden. It's an RHS partner garden, open to the National Garden Scheme, and has won several awards. I'll get all choked up now. This autumn, we won gold for the 3rd time in the South and Southeast in Bloom competition. And last week, we were named the Regional RHS Partner Garden of the Year for the South for the 2nd time. Not bad for a garden that was in such bad shape. Anthony will tell you, he thought it was over in April of 2018. 6 years into the renovation, the garden still feels like the magical, peaceful place both John and Mrs. JH loved, and it's our objective to keep it that way. Best of all, I don't have to leave. So I just want to say that my 5 gardens really tell part of my own story and how I ended up here. They also reflect that gardens go through periods of creativity and growth, and then they fall into decline. Successors are often difficult to find, and other events happen that contribute to this cycle. Sometimes gardens are lost altogether, and other times, like Garland Farms, they're found and restored. Gardens are also about the people that come together to create them, to maintain them, to enjoy them, and when necessary, to save them. So this leads me to my favorite book. I thought it would be difficult to choose one because I find garden books impossible to read. Years and years ago, when I was still working in the Senate, I tried to read Russell Page's Education of a Gardener. I thought it would be a good change from politics, so I took it on holiday, but I could not get past the first chapter because my mind kept wandering as I visualized everything he was talking about. It's been ever so. Reading garden books is torture, but boy, do I love the pictures. So I could have chosen a book that would have made it easy on myself. I could have chosen this one, which is a collection of 50 articles and lectures and bits by John Brookes, and which I edited during lockdown. This wouldn't have been a wrong choice because I actually have read every word of this book many times, and I love it. But when it comes right down to it, I read my first and favorite garden book when I was a child, cover to cover and many times. It is a book about discovery, nature, habitat, recovery, healing, health, both mental and physical, community, loss, and resilience. It is about beautiful countryside, open spaces, cultivated gardens, and the effect they have on the people who live in them. You haven't guessed, my favorite book is The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. It's about a spoiled child who's sent to live with a disagreeable and grieving uncle in Yorkshire after her parents die of typhoid in India, and her sickly, spoiled, unloved cousin who thinks he's going to die before adulthood. Mary discovers Colin's late mother's neglected garden, which is strictly off limits, and slowly draws various people into her secret as they start putting the garden to rights. Discovering the joy of weeding and gardening together and watching the first bulbs of spring come up and flourish, they flourish, regaining their health and manners. At the end, as the garden moves from winter into summer, the disagreeable uncle, Colin's father, returns. But he's begun to heal from his wife's death, and discovers that his sickly and spoiled son and niece have changed into healthy, happier children, thriving in a community of people and around them, and the garden bursting with beauty and roses. Happily ever after. To me, this book is a metaphor for what I love about my desert island gardens. They're about redemption, discovery, community, hopefulness, rejuvenation, and restoration, and about saving gardens. It's also a metaphor for how I came to be where I am, restoring Denmans, drawing together an ever-growing community of people with an interest in the garden, sharing its beauty and story with anyone who will sit still and listen, and making sure it is there for future generations. And now for my favorite garden tool. This was the easiest of all. My favorite garden tool is a chainsaw. Unfortunately, it is also one that I have the least access to, as I think that the team here, led by my husband, have hidden it from me, so I can only use it under proper supervision and with proper PPE. I don't understand why. So that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was just wonderful, Gwendolyn, just wonderful. I'm just going to leave your website up for a little bit longer before you come out of screen share. saving gardens, well, you have saved Denmans for sure. I mean,
Mm.
just brilliant. A lovely, lovely story. Starting off with you in a kilt, that is just the best photograph. And it looks like you were on a boat. Were you on a boat?
Yeah, I must have been on a canal boat because I lived in Holland as a child.
Oh, it was fantastic. And then Dunbarton Oaks, which I visited about, I don't know, well, before COVID, just before COVID, and it was in such poor state. It was so sad. It just looked like it wasn't being loved. And the thing the thing that struck me is we were there at a weekend, and there was a wheelbarrow in the middle of the lawn with flower pots spilling out of it. And it just looked like whoever was gardening on the Friday afternoon left it there and just kind of walked off. And that it's just like this metaphor for, we don't really care. It was so sad. And there were other little bits of the garden. For such an important gardener, such an important landscape designer. Anyway, we'll come out to screen share so we can have a little bit of a chat. There's lots of comments. I think you've got several people in tears by the look of it.
Oh well.
Yeah.
Don't cry, everybody. Everything's happening.
You have got several people in tears, especially when you brought out the secret garden. But no, what a wonderful story and choice and travels through your gardening world. It was just wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I don't know if anyone's got any particular questions for Gwendolyn. Lots of lovely comments about beautiful story. Wendy saying, thank you so much for this talk. I love Denmans. It's my favourite of all time. Thank you for giving me gravel garden advice. Mine is doing well even in our heat. Yeah, because Wendy, you did visit, didn't you, recently?
We had a great visit.
Yeah. Wonderful choices, particularly the chainsaw. Yeah, that's a cracking photo. Most people choose a thermos flask or, a hori knife or something, but no, Gwendolyn's got to choose a chainsaw.
Doesn't it sound like me though?
Yeah, no, absolutely brilliant, and lots of thank yous for sharing. Oh yeah, wonderful. So tell us what's happening at Denmans now and what's going to be happening in the new year. So what are the plans? Any changes? Any developments?
We have a new head gardener who joined us last March, Jonathan Arnold, who is absolutely fantastic. He was the head gardener at Petworth in the private garden for 18 years. We miss our old head gardener quite a lot, and we were very lucky to find Jonathan. And he's built up a lovely team of volunteers now. So last week, what was it, the week before, we descended on the top of the first of the riverbeds and cleared it all out, bamboo, all kinds of stuff, because those riverbeds used to be much sparser. And what's been very interesting is Mrs. Robinson's original riverbeds were actually quite narrow. And John expanded them and sort of created this island of lawn between them. So we have to figure out how to interpret both of those things. And Jonathan's been great fun to work with because we're scheming about what we're going to plant, and we're both anxious to get planting, but part of the joy is just walking by it. I think I go down there every day, rain or shine, just to see what this new space looks like, and how we're going to manipulate some of the stones so that it looks more like the riverbed is flowing the way the bed is laid out rather than straight down the hill. So
and how many times do you ask yourself, what would John think about this, or do you not? Because you knew John very well. You've got
how many times a day?
Oh, you do? Well, you do. You do. I mean, you knew him very well. You were very close to him, and thank God you came into his life when you did. But do you feel a pressure? Do you sort of question and think, well, would John do it this way or not? I mean, how do you cope with that? Decision making, or perhaps venturing off a path that John might have taken. How do you cope with that?
The interesting thing is that because it was started by someone else,
it's true,
that I never met. Anthony met her. She was. I just can't imagine John and Mrs. Robinson in the same room because they were so stubborn and opinionated. And, you know, he was not a plantsman. She was a plantsman. She was not a designer. And some of the stories we've had are pretty funny. But, you know, I sort of in my head, I've sort of divided the garden into sort of her part, his part, their part. And fortunately, she wrote a lot about the garden. Fortunately, a lot has been written about the garden, and there have been interviews with him about the garden. So drawing on that, and then my experience working with him, I think we haven't made too many mistakes.
No.
What was really fun was I'd seen a picture of the meadow as a meadow when we were working on his memoir. And I was inspired to let it go back to meadow because I saw oxeye daisies coming up, and he loved oxeye daisies. I just found out last year that the person who gave them to him, who has since died, gave them to him in the 80s, and he planted them in that meadow space. So then I went back and looked in her book, Glorious Disarray, and she's got an entire chapter on creating meadows.
Right.
From 1989, she wrote it. So yeah. I felt like we had sort of recaptured something that had been lost, possibly because of the business dispute. Yeah, I ask myself every day, which one of them is going to disagree with what I've just done?
Well, that's quite good in a way, because you can't please both of them. So you might have one on one side and one on the other. So you know,
I don't know if that's true, because they both were very aware of the environment. They were both very aware of the importance of conservation and the ecology of the site. They had quite a lot in common, or it never would have worked out. But I do sort of feel like she's here and he's there. I'm here in the middle.
Oh, Rachel is asking, do you happen to know if Glorious Disarray is still available?
I've got lots of copies of it. Yes.
You do, but I mean, it is available to buy.
It's not in print, but you can find out of print copies.
You can come, I mean, if you just go online. Okay, yeah, okay, that's great. Yeah, so yeah, okay, yes, no, Jane Mackin has said yes, you can find it on Amazon. Thank you very much. That's brilliant. Other websites are available. Other book websites are available. But
Jane also said that I'm banned for life from using the
chainsaw.
Yeah, she's my daughter, and she's just jealous she doesn't have one.
Well, of course, I can't let you go without saying the last time I was in your garden this year was for your wedding, which was held in the garden. So, and it was the most glorious event. Yes, Wendy, you might well clap. It was beautiful, theatrical, touching, lovely, relaxing, and it was just you and Mike. It was such a lovely event. And yeah, how special to be to get married there. It was lovely. Yeah, so well, thank you so much for sharing, and I'm so pleased that I didn't ask you what your choices were, because it was just so nice to go through that journey with you and discover as you went along, just such gorgeous choices. And I love the way that one links to the next one, just absolutely. And the one in the Netherlands I'd never heard of. Garland Farm I didn't know about either. Gosh, that's going to be on. Can you visit now? It is visitable?
Yeah, I think they're still open. I was there in 2014.
Right.
It is literally the size of a shoebox.
Yeah.
But as you approach it, you walk through some of the remnants of what she brought up from Reef Point. I mean, Beatrix Farrand, if I'm not mistaken, tried to donate her papers to
Berkeley.
I'm not going to name an institution that did not accept them. So that and the disappointment of Reef Point, I just sort of love the fact that she had this little garden that she was so attached to.
Yeah. Gosh, that's interesting, isn't it? Because yeah, you're not going to say who it was, but I mean, all of Gertrude Jekyll's drawings and papers and things are at Berkeley, aren't they? So no, I mean, isn't it interesting, because there's Beatrix Farrand, who's the first woman landscape architect in the States, and then there's Mien Rouse in Holland. You know, these really key women in landscape design who, you know, do not get talked about enough, actually. And maybe we should do more about them. We're going to try and focus a little bit more on women designers next year.
I know that Mien was, I shared this with Noel once. Mien came to visit John here.
Oh, did he? Yeah.
And I think he was somewhat in awe the way he wrote what he wrote.
I'm sure.
think he was quite a fan. But he said that at the end of the day, they walked through the garden and then they sat down and I think they had a cup of tea and didn't discuss the garden or plants at all. They talked about their students.
Oh, right. Oh, right. Interesting.
So I think there's a lot of continuum,
Yeah.
Marjorie Fish is another one.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another couple of comments. Is Suzanne Etherton saying, Annie, I love this format so much to see. It is a great format, and we don't do it enough. Actually, we need to do.
We need to do more commissioning.
We do, because it's such a lovely, insightful thing. But desert island plants, you're suggesting? Yes, we had thought about that actually. As a follow-on, maybe what we should do is revisit some of the people who've done desert island gardens and get them to choose their plants. And there's a thank you very much for the presentation, wonderfully put together. I love the stories about restoration of old gardens. They're worth keeping for sure. So yes, we're all very, very happy. Thank you very much,
Thank
Gwendolyn.
you, Gwendolyn. Thank you, that was great.
And have a very happy Thanksgiving.
Oh, thank you very much.
And eat lots of turkey and cranberries and what's it, pumpkin pie, or what will you have for dessert?
Jane is investigating the options. I think pear and almond tart was one of the options.
Oh, bring me back a slice. Yeah.
Yeah. Every year it's just a little bit different.
And very moving.
Oh, Anthony, it's lovely to hear your voice too.
Yes.
I remember how formidable Joyce Robinson was. One will never forget that. What a character, larger than life. And talking of larger than life, the most Amazing plant, I think, at Denmans is the Persian ironwood, the persica, which is the biggest I've ever seen, not by a little bit, but
huge bit. By
miles.
Yeah. And that's interesting. You should mention that tree, because that's a tree for the future. That's kind of top of the list of future proofing trees for the future to cope with the future climate too. So so John was ahead of his time, wasn't he?
Actually, Mrs. Robinson planted it in 1958.
Oh, really? So she was ahead of time.
Yes,
fantastic.
absolutely.
They both were, but that was hers. I think it's got about 8 trunks. I took a photograph of it today. It's her planted the
one of the first things she planted right by the cottage.
Right by the cottage. Next to Stachyurus praecox, which was her favorite spring shrub.
Oh,
and it is enormous.
Spring.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Oh,
that was brilliantly researched, yes. Gwendolyn, and absolutely wonderful.
I love the choice of the secret garden.
Oh,
one of my favorites.
I absolutely love that book.
I think there wasn't a dry eye amongst us.
I don't think there was. I think no, absolutely. No, brilliant.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you for tuning in, Anthony. And just to say to everybody, we'll be doing a little bit more with Anthony over the Christmas period, which will be a real treat for everybody. So we're looking forward to that, and we've got lots to say. Maybe we can get Gwendolyn to drop in on that one too. So anyway, everybody, it's been lovely. What a lovely evening. Thank you very much, and we'll let you know the results tomorrow. Hopefully it'll be a good one. And
I know.
Keep those fingers crossed. Okay, everybody. Listen, have a lovely evening. Lovely to see you. Thanks, Gwendolyn. Bye.